mindset. Be original military mindset.
Suggestions, we look in the mirrors at our reflections, facial expressions, the best. And oh, that's so essential. You can tell me whatever you like, but you just can't tell me and done when you know you coming home to me. Wasting money on her hair, that shit be blowing me. Like, why you get your hair done? No intermissions, let's switch positions. By the time I'm done with it, girl, you gon' need extensions. No intermissions, let's switch positions. By the time I'm done with it, girl, you gon' need extensions. No intermissions, let's switch positions. By the time I'm done with it, girl, you gon' need. Done with it, girl, you gon' need extensions. No intermissions, let's switch positions. By the time I'm done with it, girl, you gon' need extensions. No intermissions, let's switch positions. By the time I got that pencil, and for the info, G and info. Is it wrong to be so fast? you ever had when I pulled that hair. I'ma smack that ass, girls. You ain't even got to ask. She's kicking off everything but her heels. I told her you can say my name. I pull your hair until I know it's real. She's kicking off everything. She listen to Janet. That's how I know she wild. I grew up off of Snoop. You know all these suggestions. We look in the mirrors at our reflections. Facial expressions, the best ones.
A big fuck you. A big fuck you.
Dishes. By the time I'm done with it, girl, you gon' need extensions. No intermissions. Let's switch positions. By the time I'm done with it, girl, you gon' need extensions. No intermissions. Let's switch positions. By the time I'm got that pencil, and for the info, G and info. Is it wrong to be so fast? Swear I'm the best she ever had. When I pull that hair, I'ma smack that ass, girl. So you ain't even got to ask. She's kicking off everything but her heels. I told her you can say my name. I pull your hair until I know it's real. She's kicking off everything. She listen to Janet. That's how I know she wild. I grew up off of Snoop. You know all these suggestions. We look in the mirrors at our reflections. Facial expressions, the best one. Letting out aggression. Suggestions. We look in the mirrors at our reflections. Facial expressions, the best one. That's so essential. You can tell me whatever you like, but you just can't tell me N.O. Wasting money on her hair, that shit be blowing me. Like, why you get your hair done with the
Put your middle fingers, fuck you.
dishes. By the time I'm
Damn, son, where'd you find this? Damn, son, where'd you find this? Damn, son, where'd you find this? Damn, son, where'd you find this?
Show forgot that pencil. And for the info, G and info. Is it wrong to be so fast? Swear I'm the best she ever had. When I pull that hair, I'ma smack that ass, girl. So you ain't even got to ask. She's kicking off everything but her heels. I told her you can say my name. I pull your hair until I know it's real. She's kicking off everything. She listen to Janet. That's how I know she wild. I grew up off of Snoop. You know all these suggestions. We look in the mirrors at our reflections. Facial expressions, the best one. Letting out aggression. Suggestions. We look in the mirrors at our reflections. Facial expressions, the best one. That's so essential. You can tell me whatever you like, but you just can't tell me N.O. Wasting money on her hair, that shit be blowing me. Like, why you get your hair done when you know you coming home to me?
original military mindset. The original military mindset.
Damn, son, where'd you find this? Damn, son, where'd you find this? Damn, son, where'd... Put your middle fingers in. Fuck you.
Dishes by the time I'm and I hope I ain't misled, cause I sure forgot that pencil. And for the info, she an info. Is it wrong to be so fast? Well, I'm the best she ever had. When I pull that hair, I'ma smack that ass, girl, so you ain't even got to ask. She's kicking off everything but her heels. I told her, you can say my name, I'll pull your hair until I know it's real. She's kicking off everything. She listen to Janet, that's how I know she wild. I grew up off of Snoop, you know, all these suggestions. We look in the mirrors at our reflections, facial expressions, the best one, letting out aggression. Suggestions, we look in the mirrors at our reflections, facial expressions, the best one. Hold up, that's so essential. You can tell me whatever you like, but you just can't tell me N.O. Wasting money on her hair, that shit be blowing me. Like, why you get your hair done when you know you coming home to me? Hair done when you know you coming home to me. Mindset.
Smoking on me. Smoking on me. Smoking on
Son,
me.
where'd you find this? Damn, son, where'd
Smoking on me. Smoking on me. Smoking on me.
put your middle fingers in? Fuck you.
Dishes by the time I'm I don't need no intro, and I hope I ain't misled, cause I sure forgot that pencil. And for the info, she an info. Is it wrong to be so fast? Swear I'm the best she ever had. When I pull that hair, I'ma smack that ass, girl, so you ain't even got to ask. She's kicking off everything but her heels. I told her, you can say my name, I'll pull your hair until I know it's real. She's kicking off everything. She listen to Janet, that's how I know she wild. I grew up off of Snoop, you know, doggies, digestion. We look in the mirrors at our reflections, facial expressions, the best one, letting out aggression. Digestion. We look in the mirrors at our reflections, facial expressions, the best one.
Smoking on me.
Hold up. That's so essential. You can tell me whatever you like, but you just can't tell me N.O. Wasting money on her hair, that shit be blowing me. Like, why you get your hair done when you know you coming home to me?
Laced. Laced. Laced.
Up for him. Now when you better view, you go for him. Whatever you tell the code. Whatever you tell the code. Be original military mindset. Be original military mindset.
Be taking you on this journey. In this course we'll be making the assets for the environment you can see in the background, along with other fun scenes. It's meant for complete beginners and it's set up very methodically in terms of building up slowly with lots of repetition, so it's best not to skip any lectures. Having said that, this first section is going through the interface and you might already be comfortable with that, so you may want to go through at maybe double speed and not worry too much about the challenges. This course is built in a follow along style, so for best results have Blender open whilst watching and work through with me and practice with the challenges that I set in most of the videos. Within this first section we'll be making a very basic Blender scene, and there'll be lots of information about how to join the community, which can be very beneficial for interacting with others that are going through the same course as you. If you do get stuck, the community space is a great place you can ask questions, and our teaching assistants are on hand to help. Within this course I'll be showing lots of different techniques for building environment modules. Some are quick and easy and others are more time consuming, but they often have more detailed results. So by the end of the course you'll have a great understanding of how to build different modules and when to use them for different scenarios. So let's get started. In this lecture I'll quickly show you how you can download Blender and show you where you can find the experimental versions which you might want to take a look at. So the first thing that you'll want to do when starting your journey into the world of 3D is to download Blender. Blender is open source and therefore completely free. You go along to blender.org and you should see something similar to this, and you'll want the download section. Now the current full release is Blender 3.0.1 and Blender's updated fairly quickly, and you'll want to get the most up-to-date version, which you'll see here. That will be the most stable release and I strongly recommend you use that one. You can also get different versions for different operating systems. You can also, if you scroll down to the bottom here, go experimental. If I click on that, there are older versions here and there's also experimental versions. So 3.1 is in beta at the moment, and that will probably be the stable release by the time this course comes out to you, and that's actually what you'll be downloading in the previous screen. And we've also got 3.2 alpha. The alpha version is where they're testing lots of new things, adding new features, so it can be a bit temperamental and crash. The beta version, they're doing bug fixes, so it's a bit more stable than the alpha, but you still have to be prepared for the odd crash here and there. I'll be using version 3.1 to try and make this course a bit more future-proof, and like I say, that's most likely what you'll be seeing. There won't be much on a beginner level that will change between these newer versions, so it shouldn't make too much difference when following along with the course. If there is a major change, then I will update the course and the videos. If you do choose to download the beta or alpha, then it will appear as a zip file. When you unzip it and go into the folder, you run the Blender application from here, so you don't actually have to install it. Downloading the main stable version, you'll have to install the program, and like I say, I would thoroughly recommend using that one as a beginner. If you're running Blender for the very first time, then keep these default settings and press Save New Settings. If you've used Blender before and you're happy with your settings, then you can load them in from previous versions. So I'll press Save New Settings. From here we'll go to New File and choose General. I like to go to Edit Preferences and change my resolution scale to 1.25. That way everybody can see my screen nice and easily. But you of course don't have to do that. And if you're ever in any doubt about which version you're using, it's down in the bottom right hand corner here. So make sure you've downloaded your preferred version of Blender and we're ready to go.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm here to show you where to ask questions and get support so you don't get stuck while taking this course. For all of these and everything else I talk about in this video, you'll find the links in the resources, either to the right or down below. If you can't find English captions where you're watching this, I've provided a YouTube link in resources explaining how to get them. First, we have the Game Dev TV Community Forum. This is a great place to ask questions and share your work. You'll get a ton of support from our teaching assistants and lots of encouragement from other students. When you're asking a question, please give as much information as possible and include any relevant code. This really helps the teaching assistants get you unstuck quicker. For more real-time chats, head over to our super active Discord server. You can ask specific questions in the relevant channels, or there's the lounge for more general game dev chat. We have thriving communities on Facebook with dedicated groups for Unity, Unreal, Blender, and 2D art. This is another great place to share your progress through the course and ask questions. And talking about sharing, if you do share your work on Twitter or Instagram, then please tag us. We love to see your creations. You can read about other game dev students and their journeys, as well as get hints and tips over on the blog. And we have a weekly live cast where you can get industry insights and advice from game dev veterans. I hope that helps keep you unstuck. Now go enjoy the course. We can't wait to see what you create.
Is this big window here. We've got different windows to the side and at the bottom, which I'll talk about later. In the 3D viewport, you can press the middle mouse button to rotate around your objects. And incidentally, I've got my keyboard shortcut keys displayed down the corner here. So when I press middle mouse button, you can see what I've pressed. If I hold down Shift,
Oh, I forgot to get on the fucking. Uh-oh, my bad. mesclado. Sometimes you are just trying to get along. You used to keep that for it. No, it's going to teach you how to play the instrument. Everything they play with it. They won't teach you that. Manipulation. What is this? It's not- I don't know what's that. Fuck with those guys. I can't hear anybody, so it doesn't seem like it's playing much shit.
To move your objects into a kind of clump in the middle here, I want you to rotate the cylinder so it's lying on its side.
There we go. Right? No. Shit. What the hell? Oh. Sorry, I'm sorry.
R to rotate, to move it around until it's roughly in line, and to grab to move that on the floor. And I need to rotate it just a little bit back again to get it just right. And there we go, we've got it sitting on the floor. It's overlapping our cylinder, so you might want to press R to rotate around the Z axis so it doesn't do that. Or you can
it's not playing that.
The cylinder, we can come around to the side again and press R to rotate, or we can type in 90 for 90 degrees and press enter. And you can see the rotation around the x-axis 90 degrees just there. And again, I can rotate around the z-axis so it's not overlapping the 90. And lastly, the torus. Let's press numpad period to find selected, and I can actually type in a value here, such as rotate the y-axis this time, 90 degrees, and it rotates at 90 degrees. Let's press 1 on the numpad to go to front view, G then Z to move it upwards. And there we have our objects clumped together, and we can obviously tidy this up a little bit and move them into position as you see fit. And lastly, I want to talk about saving your work because we'll want to use this for the next lecture.
Oh, did it just die out? What the hell?
Like most programs, you go up to File, in this case Save As, or Save will take you to the same menu, give it a sensible title and press Save. So that concludes this lecture. Make sure you have saved your work ready for next time.
Intro shit anyway, man. Intro shit, you know. Cannot see shit. I'm not doing it.
In this lecture, we'll test out the different options for viewing our scene, and we'll be rendering out our scene as a still image and talking about the rendering options available.
I think there's a check here.
So here's where we got up to last time, and in order to think about adding colour and materials to our objects, we first need to think about how we're viewing our objects. We have different view options up here. You can hover over them to see their different names. At the moment we're in solid mode, and that gives us some shadow, as you can see, to make out the shapes, but it's all very grey, and it doesn't give us any reflections or shadows given off by the objects onto each other. So this monkey's shadow onto the floor, for example. Next to that, to the left, we have wireframe mode, which is very useful for aligning objects. If I go to front view with one on my keyboard, you can see that I can see through the objects, and therefore I can kind of line them up nice and easily. I'll press the middle mouse button to come out of orthographic mode. So that's wireframe mode, solid mode, and then we have what's called material preview mode. Now that's actually showing off the materials of our objects and the colors. They're all white at the moment, so they're giving off a white material, which we will change eventually. So it's different to solid mode because we actually see the colors of our objects. The one next to that is called rendered mode. Now this is what you will finally see when you render out your scenes as 2D still images or animations. This shows the materials. They're all white at the moment, but we have a grey background lighting our scene, so it's making them look very grey. We're seeing the shadows of our objects, which is the effects of this light up here. If I click on that light and press G to grab and move it around, you can see it updates all the shadows depending on where I move it. I'll left click to set it there. And if you haven't already, pause the video and have a play with those different modes and moving the light around to see the effect in rendered mode. So the render preview is a representation of what you'll see when you render. To see our actual render, we can press 0 on the numpad to go into the camera view, or press the camera icon on the right hand side. Now your camera might be in a slightly different location to mine, or your objects might be in a different location, and we can move the camera by pressing N on our keyboard to bring out the menu on the side here, and that's N to hide it as well. And remember, you can press that little arrow as well if you forget the keyboard shortcut. And if we go to view, there's a view lock option here, and we can tick the camera to view. I'll just extend this out so you can read it. Camera to view, tick that, and now when we move about, it moves our camera as if it's a viewport, so I can hold down shift and middle mouse button to strafe it around, zoom in and out, and so on. So once again, pause the video here and go into camera mode with 0 on your numpad, or you can press the camera icon here and bring up your tool panel with N, go to view and lock the camera to view and move your camera into position. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so now we've got our camera into position, I can show you rendering out our scene. The render menu is up the top corner here, and I can click on that and render image is here. F12 is the keyboard shortcut. And I'll click that and you can see my render just there. And you can see it's very similar to what we have in the viewport there, and it opens up a completely new window, and you can save your images in here in the normal way, much like saving your scene. I'll talk a little bit about animating the camera and rendering animations later on. I can close down this window in the normal way by clicking on the cross in the corner, and there is one other important point that I want to make about rendered mode or rendered view up here. It's almost precisely what you will see in your final render, except if I go across to the outliner, you can see there's an eye here for this light and a camera. If I click on the eye, that will hide our light. However, if I press F12 now, we can still see the final result. I'll close that down. That's because our camera here is still enabled, and that's what it will display when rendered. So the eye is the display in the viewport here, and if I turn off the camera now and keep the eye and press F12, you can see that we can't see the light in rendered view. I'll close that down. So this is render view and this is display view. So occasionally if something appears in your render that you're not expecting, it may be because you've got the camera ticked but not the viewport ticked. So you can't see it in your viewport, but it's coming out in the render. And that can be useful if you want to hide things in your scene, just to make it easier to model and interact with your objects. So pause the video and test that out, hiding your light from the display and hiding your light from the render, and render out your scenes to see the difference. Now the other thing to point out about rendered view is that there are different types of render engine. We can see these by coming down to the render properties just here, and the render engine is at the top here. The default is set to Eevee, which is doing a nice job, but it's not actually realistic in terms of how light interacts with objects. A more realistic render engine is called Cycles. So if I click on the drop down here and change across to Cycles, you can see there's much more depth in the shadow information, and you can see in the crevices in here, it gets darker and the shadow softens up. However, if I move my camera, so using the middle mouse button to move the camera, you can see all this graininess to the image. And you'll see up the top corner here, the sample count whenever I move. So although Cycles is a better render engine than Eevee in terms of realism, it isn't a real-time render engine. So if I change back to Eevee, under the render engine settings, speed things up even more. I'll close that down and I'll come across to the device and change to the GPU. And you can see this is now a lot quicker. There's also options to get rid of this graininess that we can see here, and that's called noise. If we go down to the sampling section here, this is where we can increase or reduce the samples, and that will change how long Cycles spends on one frame, calculating all the light bounces. Reducing the samples will reduce the render time, but you'll end up with a more grainy image. But below that we have the denoise option. If you tick that, you can see that I'm getting almost an instant update, but I'm still getting a lot of detail in the shadows. If we take a quick look at the denoise, it should be set to automatic by default, so mine will be using optics because I've got an RTX card. Otherwise it will be using the open image denoise for anything else, and that's taking that graininess and kind of averaging it out and things and cleverly getting rid of that noise. Okay, so it's time for a challenge. If you haven't already, set up your camera and objects into a nice kind of scene similar to what I have here. Then you're going to test out the different rendering options, both Eevee and Cycles. So render one image out in Eevee, obviously taking a note of how long it takes. It should be fairly instant, and then change to Cycles and do a few tests with that. And if you've got a compatible GPU, then maybe one without the GPU and one with, and test out the denoising options. Once you've tried out all those things, do make sure you've saved your work ready for next time. In this lecture we're looking at materials and adding colours and different surface properties to our objects. So here's where we got up to last time, and now we understand the render views, we can start adding colour to our objects. In order to do that, we have different workspaces up the top here, and one of them is called shading. I'll click on that, and you can see how we've got lots of different windows now. We've got our normal 3D viewport here, and it's controlled in the same way with either the Cartesian coordinates over the side here or the numpad. We've also got the shader editor, the image editor, and the file browser here. You can change any of these windows and adapt them with the options just up here, and you can see this one is the shader editor. You can also resize these windows. As soon as you move your mouse over the middle of the two, you can left click and drag to resize the windows, and it's helpful to have a bit more space for the shader editor, so I can click and drag that up to there. Now don't follow along with me now, but I'll show you that you can, if I bring my mouse over the middle of these two and right click, I can join two areas together, and it gives me this arrow asking which one do I want to overtake the other. So if I click this way, it will make the whole base the shader editor. Now to get that back, it is actually a touch awkward, but I move up to the very corner here where the crosshairs are, click and drag out, and now it's created a new window based on the previous one that was there. So I can come up here and change that back to the image editor. Now for the moment I won't use these two windows, but we can just keep them there for now. One thing it's worth pointing out that if I accidentally click on the corner here and make lots of these tiny windows trying to sort them out, we can kind of reset the whole view. Unfortunately we can't come up to the top here and right click, there is no reset button, but we can delete this view, that takes us to one of the other ones, and add a new one here under general, and then that is the shading workspace, and you can see it's back to where it was. However, it is in a different order. You can right click and start reordering these around, but that's not too important. The other thing you'll notice that when you go into the shader editor is that your viewport display is set to material preview mode. So we can see the color of our objects, but no shadows, and they have got some lighting on them. In fact, what you can see in the background, if I middle mouse button to scroll around, you can see this sort of blurred image in the background, and that's actually the same as this sphere here. That image is lighting our scene. So the light bits are very bright and offering a lot of light, and the darker bits are offering less light. And that gives a nice natural and kind of realistic lighting of our scene. So let's add some color and texture to our objects. So once again, I'll squeeze this area up. So we've got a nice big shader editor space here. I'm going to click on any of the objects except the default cube. So let's click on the monkey, for example, assuming you've still got one in your scene. And you'll notice this has no material so far, it's got nothing in the shader editor. If I click on the default cube, that has a material called material, which has already been set up for us. So we'll come back to that one later, So let's click on the monkey and create a new material for this. So click on the new, and I'll just zoom out a touch so you can see the whole thing. We've got this big node here called the principled BSDF, which is plugged into the material output. Now nodes can get a little bit confusing for the beginner, so I'll introduce them very slowly. The main thing you want to think about is this principled BSDF here, and there's 4 areas of the principled BSDF that we're going to focus on. The first one, if I zoom in and scroll up a bit, incidentally these are similar controls to the viewports up here, with the middle mouse button moving around and zooming in and out. So at the top here we have the base color. So I can click on that and I get the color wheel. You may have seen this in other programs, but we can drag this middle point, which is the color, into a different area. And in fact we can't see the monkey, so what I'm going to do is move this across slightly, because it always appears just above, and create a nice red color here. Towards the outside of the circle are saturated colors, so very colorful, and less colorful the closer we go to the inside. So we'll make a nice saturated vivid red. On the side we have the value slider, which is how bright or how dark the image is, so I'll make it a nice bright red, and when I move away that color wheel disappears and we're left with our red color here. So I can rename this material up top here to a red material, so we'll call it red. And now's a good time to pause the video and catch up with me adding a new material to your monkey or any other object except the default cube, and giving it a nice red base color. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so that's the base color. Another important attribute in the principled BSDF is the metallic. Now objects are either metallic or dielectric, or non-metallic, so this slider really should be at 1 or 0. So 0, if we zoom in on our monkey, in fact let's press the full stop key to frame selected, then move in a bit. At the moment it looks kind of plasticky because it's non-metallic. If I click and drag the slider up to the top, you can see that sort of metallic look there. We can kind of see some reflections in this, but it's not particularly good, and that's one limitation of material preview mode as it is at the moment. Let's quickly change that and go across to our render properties here. Now my render engine is still on cycles, so let's quickly go to render view and see what that looks like. And we can see a few reflections, such as the whiteness from the floor and the whiteness from this object here on our metallic monkey. However, back to material preview mode, we don't get the same effect, so there's no sort of whiteness from the cylinder or the floor. However, material preview mode is based upon Eevee, so if I change my render engine across to Eevee and change the screen space reflections attribute here and tick that, can you see how the monkey turned a bit more white, getting reflections from the floor and the cylinder over here? It's still not particularly great, we don't have those shadows, but it does offer something which will certainly help us to see the materials a bit better. So screen space reflections in the render properties under Eevee will help material preview mode show those reflections. So quickly put the metallic slider all the way up to 1, change your render engine to Eevee and turn on the screen space reflections and see what it looks like in material preview mode now. Now closely related to the metallic is the roughness. So if I bring the roughness right up, it makes it, as you can see, a very rough metal. But if I drag it all the way down, it's very shiny. And you can start to see some of those reflections a bit more. We've got the reflected environment there, as well as some of the floor. Although it's not particularly good, let's see what that looks like in our rendered viewport. Not that different because we're still using the render engine Eevee. Let's change it across the cycles and see what it looks like. We're getting much more of the reflections from things like the cylinder here and the floor as well. We're not seeing an environment in the background. That's because we've got this grey background, which will change later on. Anyway, let's change back to material preview mode and pause the video here and have a play with the roughness slider. Now the last two important attributes are emission and normals. I will talk about those later on, but just so you know, the emission color and the emission strength here, you can turn things into lights with those, and the normals is the bumpiness of the object. But like I say, we'll come back to those later on. And at that point, you've got a good understanding of the principled BSDF, and with those attributes you can make almost all the materials we're going to use in the course. Now I'll just zoom out a touch and choose a different object, such as the torus here. So we can add a new material to this, and what I want you to do is pause the video here and have a go at adding a blue, non-metallic, rough material to this object. So pause the video and have a go at that. So we click new, and in fact I'll label this blue. The metallic is already set to 0. Let's change the color to blue, and we can make it saturated, a little bit darker perhaps this time, just for something different. So that's the color. It's already set to 0 on metallic. We can bring the roughness right up, and then we've got our blue, rough, non-metallic material. So hopefully you got on okay with that. Now I want you to click on a different object, let's say the cylinder this time, and we can actually click on this little down arrow here and choose the materials we've already got in the scene. This is the default white material, it's on the default cube that we started with, but here's our blue and the red. So let's choose the blue, and we can use the blue from this on this object. But be aware, if I change the colour of this, let's make it a slightly brighter blue and bring it across to the purples a bit, you can see that it's changed both of them. So you have to think of these materials like paint buckets, and these two objects are using the same paint. So whatever changes I make in here, let's say a metallic and a shiny purple, they will be updated on both materials. So I'll move those back with the roughness up to 1 and metallic down to 0. So pause the video and give one of the other objects, apart from the default cube, the same material as the monkey. Okay, so hopefully you clicked on an object, clicked on the down arrow, and chose the red. So your final challenge for this lecture is to create new materials for each of your other objects, including the floor, and experiment a little with those different sliders, giving them different colours and surface properties. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you remembered. You can come in, choose an object. I want to create a new material this time, I'll call it orange. Across to my base colour, bring that over to the orange here, and we'll make it fairly bright. A nice shiny orange, so no roughness, and that looks fine. I'll do the other two objects as well. The sphere, add new, call this pink base colour, across to the pinks here, and nice and bright. This time I'll make it nice and rough. The floor, new material, bringing the value down slightly, and maybe a little bit of bluey green there. It's sort of a greeny grey, so let's call it green grey. And lastly, the default cube, that's already got a material, but we'll change that colour as well. I'll give this a brown colour because that's sometimes hard to find. You come over to the reddy orangey colours and you just bring the value down, and that creates a brown material. And let's make this nice and rough again and call it brown. So hopefully you got on okay with that, and now you've got all your objects with a material. So once again, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture we'll talk about adding images to the background to make our renders look that much better, and we'll talk a bit about render settings. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and to talk about the background I'm going to bring down our main window here and make the shader editor a bit smaller. And if we take a look at our viewport at the moment, everything's kind of looking alright, but it's got no shadows on the floor, and that's a limitation of material preview mode. However, we can go to this down arrow here and choose scene lights, and that will light our scene using this light that we've got just up the top there. I'll zoom out just a touch and you can see that there, and now we've got some shadows on the floor. But let's go across to render properties and go across to cycles and then choose render view up here. It looks much more realistic, but we haven't got that lovely background with its reflections. So there's material preview mode, which has some nice reflections, it's really nicely lit, but cycles has this horrible grey background. Well, in order to change that, we come down here in the shader editor, and where it says object, we click on that and change it to world. Now often your world nodes will be somewhere else, and we can press the home key to frame them. And this is very similar to material nodes, except it's a background node into a world output. But it has a color attribute, and we can make this brighter, and you'll see it makes our scene brighter. Now it looks a lot better, but it still hasn't got that lovely lighting that we had in material preview mode, which is this HDR high dynamic range image in the background, giving off light in the light spots and less in those dark spots. And it gives off a certain color as well, so there's a slight green light coming off these green areas. And you'll see that you can see these reflections in some of our objects. So how can we make rendered view have a nice background like this? Well, we'll need to download one of these HDRI images. A great place for that is called Polyhaven. They also do some nice textures, which we will talk about later as well. But for now, we'll look at the HDRIs here. So if we click Browse HDRIs, we've got all these images we can pick from. We've got indoor, outdoor, skies, and so forth. So in just a moment, choose 3 of these to download. Try and choose ones that have slightly different colours in, so you can see the effects of those different colours. So a nice grey one like this snowy field here, a greeny one like this, and a reddy one like this perhaps. When you click on them, let's take this country club one here, you've got an option for the download here. You don't really need it to be 16K, that will just take long to render. 2K will be absolutely fine, and then press download. So pause the video here and download 3 HDRIs from Polyhaven. So now that we're back into Blender, we need to bring that image into here. I'll move my two nodes across, and you can obviously select them both and left click and drag them to move them about, and click away to deselect them, and then select one to move it individually. You've also got a little disclosure arrow here to minimize each of these nodes. So I've moved them across to the right hand side here, and we add a new object in the same way. So there's the add menu here, or Shift A to add, and we've got lots of different options. We want a texture and we want an environment texture. Later on we'll be bringing lots of image textures in, but don't get confused between an environment texture and an image texture. So we want the environment texture. Click on that, and then I can bring it to the front here. And now I've got my environment texture node, and I want to open a new file. So I'll click on open, and now I need to navigate to where I stored my HDRI. I have a folder called HDRIs, which I put in my Blender folder, and these are the ones that I've downloaded. If you want to see what they look like, then you can press on the thumbnails just up here, and you can see the different options, and there's the Country Club one, and there's a grey one there and a green one here. So I'll choose the Country Club one to start off with. It doesn't matter what you've chosen, just open one of them up, and I'll zoom out just a touch so you can see my nodes easily, and I need to drag from the colour into the colour. So nodes are color coded, and you can see green to green there and yellow to yellow there, and that will help you know what will go into what. So once I've done that, let's go across to rendered mode and see what's happened. So I've got this lovely HDRI image in the background here of this country club, and you can see it's got a really nice realistic look on my objects now. There's bright spots in here, which is lighting the scene and giving off these shadows, and there's darker spots giving off less light, and there's color as well coming from this HDRI. To open a different one, I can come down here to open image and find a different one to use. Let's try this sunset in the quarry, I think it is, and it's a nice grey looking one, so try that. And notice how bluey grey the scene went when I used that, and there's the light source there, and we've got some nice shadows, and it really does look nice and realistic when we get that HDRI in. Let's just quickly jump back to material preview mode, which is using Eevee, and you can see the difference in quality of the render. This one just looks a little bit flat and lifeless, and then rendered mode with cycles, using that HDRI in the background, has so much more warmth with the light bouncing around, and the shadows look much more realistic. Let's unplug this to see what I had before, and to unplug it I can click and drag to pull that noodle away from the colour. We've got that horrible dull grey background there, and then when I plug it in, we've got that beautiful lighting. So your challenge then is to try out 3 different HDRIs in the background to see what they look like and the type of lighting they give off. Once you've done that, do 3 different renders, moving your camera each time to a different position to get a different kind of look. If you find that your render is taking a long time, then just do one for the moment, and I'll go through rendering settings in a moment. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully remember to go to camera mode. You either press this icon over here or 0 on your numpad. And at the moment, if I middle mouse button, I just come out of camera view. So let's go back into camera view with 0 and press N on my keyboard to bring up my toolbar. And in the view tab, option here, and click the camera to view. I'll just make that bigger so you can see, so camera to view. And now I can reposition my camera and render the scene. The render options are up here, or you can press F12. And depending on the power of your machine, your render may take a little while or be fairly quick. Mine took 17 seconds, and it's given a nice image. I'll just close that down for a moment and quickly talk about the render options down here, and this is under the render properties here. If you find your render is taking too long, go to where it says sampling here and make sure that's open, and the render samples is what we want to look at. The easiest thing to do is just to set a time limit here, let's say 5 seconds, then you know exactly how long it's going to take. You might want to choose the denoising option as well if you find that it's quite a noisy image. So now if I press F12, you can see the time it's taking there. It usually goes a little bit over 5 seconds because it's got to do the denoise calculation as well. And there we go, we've got a nice image in 5 seconds. So if I move this across, we didn't really need those 4,000 samples because we still managed to get a nice image after 5 seconds, which is probably using more like 500 samples. So hopefully you got on okay with that, and you might want to take a moment to try out different render settings and different time limits with or without the denoise as well, and see how you get on. Do remember to share your journey so far with people on the forums and look and see how they're getting on. It's a good idea to save your work here, but you don't actually need this file for the next lecture.
You know? You get all that? Yeah, I'm going to correct him here. Just a little bit. But you go into your samples here, when you do that, where you're rendering, I can't even fucking find that. Whatever. Can't find it right now. Yeah, right here. All this shit. It'll say how many samples there are. Hey, you gotta follow him anyway. But I'm telling you, don't pick seconds and shit. Don't pick time. Pick samplings. Alright? For reals. Just wanting to enlighten you a little bit. That the second shit is for birds. Any questions? Let me know. I know you probably can't hear me that well. I don't even know where I put my HD anymore. I think they're in that fucking Dropbox. I don't know if I can reach them anyway. I won't go too far because I don't know what's where. I don't see a Dropbox here. Different file. Or a different user. I'll show you dash too if you want that. Shit, no. Alright, anyway. Like it, right, this ain't an HDMR, but you can pick any plane or background. That's what it is, HDR. And you can use it. So like, see, it'll be just a plane, but if it's HDR, it will swing all the way. Yep. Anyway, yeah. And it will be down here too. If you click on the image, it should be there. Anyway. Anyway. That's where you would get like if you needed, you know, long or some shit. All right. Yes. What the hell? All right, now I'm tripping. Oh, I know. There it is. I thought it was sphere. I picked the circle. Could be able to. Oh. I don't like the new blender down there, man. Something's fucked up there. I don't like it. Oh, what the fuck? That's gonna be mad now. Edit mode, okay, yeah. That's your art and all that stupid shit you showed in the beginning. I don't understand why it wouldn't work here. What was edit? See, you got edited. That's another thing. I couldn't understand how you could texture. You gotta add it, right? Yeah. Texture. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I just had to check. Let's put an attachment to the camera, see when you go to, yeah, render it. It's gotta be teaching UV pretty soon. Man. Alright, anyway. Back to the show, man.
So now you have a good understanding of the interface, we're going to jump right in and make a landscape. This will help you to practice the skills we've just learned in section 1 and build on those skills by learning new techniques and tools. We're going to build a fun low poly castle. Low poly is a simplistic style that comes from the term low polygon, which means the objects have a low face count. It's an art style that can be great fun for beginners, and it's also really good for performance in games, so you often see that style used in mobile games. It's really good for beginners because it helps you to break complex objects down into simpler forms, which is really the essence of 3D modeling. So let's make a castle together. In this lecture we'll start making a castle buildings, and we'll create the first wall module that we'll build our castle with. We'll also be talking about edit mode and object mode, a really important aspect of modeling 3D shapes. So in order to build our simple castle, we need to make some modules. We're going to make a wall and a tower, and then we'll repeat those around to make our castle structure. We'll talk more about building with modules later, but modules are simply objects that you repeat over and over to build up bigger scenes nice and quickly. So I'm in the default startup file, and let's start by selecting the default cube, and I can scale this in the y-axis, so that's the green, and I can just pull it in until it becomes a thin wall roughly around this sort of size. And yours can be a little bit different, but if you want my precise measurements, remember that the object properties are down here. So I've gone to 0.177. Now, in order to make the crenellations, as they're known, which are the bumpy bits that come out of the wall, that are typical in castle structures, we need to go into this shape and edit it. So I'll zoom into this object with period key on my numpad, and in order to go into edit mode, I can come up to the different modes here in the top left, where it says object mode, click on that and press edit mode. And now we're actually inside this particular shape and able to edit it. The different points are known as vertices, and we can select on each of those to start off with. And with one selected, you can press G to grab. I'll right click to cancel that though, because we don't need to do that. However, I can't rotate or scale a single vertex, but if I select two with shift left click, I can scale those or rotate those. And each time I'm pressing right click to cancel that transformation, because we actually want to keep it like this. So that's vertices. We've also got the option to select edges up here and faces. So let's start with edges, and now I can go around selecting the edges, and again I can scale these up or G to grab to move, and then faces, which of course correspond to the faces, and again I can move those and grab them as I see fit. So just pause the video for a moment and test that out for yourself, looking at vertices, edges and faces, and just select them so you're comfortable with where they sit on the shape. Okay, so I'll come around to the front, and we want some crenellations coming out of the top, but we haven't got enough vertices, edges and faces to do that. So we need to add some more. I'll zoom out just a touch. What we'll need to do is put some cuts in here so we can bring out the top faces. There's two main options for creating new vertices and faces. That's the loop cut and the extrusions. Now in edit mode, our toolbar does change down the side here, and I can click and drag on the edge so you can see the names of the different tools, and the one we'll be using is the loop cut. The shortcut is Ctrl R. It's much easier to use the shortcuts. I actually very rarely use this toolbar down the side here, so again I'll encourage you to get used to the keyboard shortcuts. But if you ever get lost, most of the tools you can find down the side here. So the first thing I'm going to do is the loop cut tool with Ctrl R. When I press Ctrl R and move over my shape, you can see where the cut is going to be made depending on where I move my mouse. And it tries to cut all the way through the shape. It will actually only go through quads or rectangles, so four-sided faces, but I'll talk more about that later on. Now we actually need more cuts than this, so I'll use the wheel of my mouse, or you can use page up and page down if you don't have a wheel for any reason. And I want to create 5 cuts going through like that. I'll explain why 5 in a moment. Once I've got my cuts, I can left click once, and then it asks me where I want to move them to. I want them to be even, so I want them to stay where they were, and I can actually right click to cancel any movement. Now I'll do that once more to explain again, so I'll undo that with Ctrl Z, Ctrl R to do the loop cut, use the wheel of my mouse to bring it up to 5, and I can actually double left click to set it in place, which is a bit quicker than left click and then right click. But you do have to click twice because you're setting the location first and then setting it in place second. So pause the video here and catch up with me creating 5 loop cuts from top to bottom of your shape. Now what this has enabled us to do is to bring out these faces at the top with what's called extrusions. So we've got our extrude options here, or you can see the keyboard shortcut is E. So we need to select these faces first, and currently I'm in edge mode, so I need to change to face mode, and I can select these top faces across here. Then to bring the faces out, I press E to extrude, which is the same as this tool here, so E to extrude, and move my mouse upwards and left click to set in place. So now hopefully you can see why we needed those loop cuts in first before we could do the extrusion. For a complete beginner, it does take a little while to understand when to use loop cuts and when to use extrusions, so this does take a little bit of practice to get used to, but once you get it, those are the 2 main tools for editing shapes. So there we've made our wall. We'll add a bit more complexity to this later, but for now this will work well. So pause the video here and catch up with me making your wall by doing 5 loop cuts and 3 extrusions of those top faces. Okay, so there's our wall module. Now we can easily repeat this over and over to make a nice long wall. Before we create another section though, it's important to understand that we are in edit mode and we need to go back into object mode to copy the whole shape. To go back into object mode, we come up to here and go to object mode. The shortcut key for that is tab. So if I press
Now you
tab,
just have
we
the
go
big
to edit
block.
mode and object mode. So now I'll zoom out just a touch, and to duplicate this object, I can press Shift D for duplicate. That's also in the object menu up here under duplicate objects. So Shift D will create a new copy, and I can constrain this movement to the X-axis and move it across over to here, and I've got a castle wall. There's a useful command called Shift R which repeats the last action, and you can create a nice long wall like this. Now hopefully you can see why I chose to do 5 loop cuts, because I wanted to have one extrusion at one end and no extrusion at the other, so it would repeat nice and easily along my wall. So pause the video here and duplicate your wall with Shift D and move it along the X-axis. Then press Shift R to repeat that action to create 2 more wall modules. Pause the video and have a go at that.
Here we go. Here we go.
Okay, so actually we don't need these new modules just yet, so I'm going to select all those. Just double check you haven't got anything extra selected like the light, so I can control box select the light or control click the light to make sure that's not selected, and press delete. And when making
you
modules,
deleted
it's
it.
really
I
useful
told
to
you.
name your objects
Always
so they
delete
don't
the
get
shit.
confused. So let's click on our object. The easiest way to rename an object is to come up to the outliner and double left click. Alternatively, I'll press escape to come out of that. You can press F2 to name your object as well, and I'll call it wall module. So there we have it, our first wall module, ready for building our castle. Make sure you've caught up with me and you've got one single wall module there which has been renamed, and do also make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time.
Is it okay if I use the... I'm gonna go through that a little bit. Delete everything. That's what he should have told you. Delete everything. Just fucking delete it. Jesus. You're a little winded, buddy. If I can find it. You can go up top here and go to add or oh yeah, I'm gonna be in object mode. That'll fuck you up every time, I swear to God. Object mode is bits and edit. It's just like when you go to click and then you in animate and you don't fucking you know, go to pose mode. If you don't go to pose mode, you're like, what the hell is wrong with this? Same shit. Same shit. It screws up everybody, I'm telling you. Hit control and you can select everything like that, or single or file or wait. Is it shift or control? It's shift or control, man, I'm telling you. There it is, shift. I've got all 3 of them. Right click, delete. Boom. And let's go to mesh, add mesh. Then you got some down here you should have that are new. So you don't have to really build a wall like he's doing. You can just use it. I'm telling you. It'll be like add extra shit, you know, in your plugins or add-ons. I don't have it, I guess not. Because I've been fucking with other shit and I don't want it, you know, it didn't fold yet. So I only got a few. Let's see. I should probably turn them on for this. Maybe. So there's add-ons. Come on, bitch. Yeah, see, I don't have anything pretty much turned on. A couple of them. That's where I was doing animation and shit. So you don't want a bunch of shit. You know, you just want what you need. Don't stack up because you got it all. It doesn't help. But like down here, there'll be something like add meshes. See them? Like simple and all that shit. There's one in here that says add extra. And then it'll have your walls and all kinds of dumb shit. That'll make it a lot easier. And you can pull them out with extrude E, like he's talking about, and just do it that way in edit mode. Alright? That makes sense? Alright. Alright. I'm ready to go. You should be too.
In this lecture we'll be making the tower for our castle, and we'll be looking at the inset tool and thinking about problems you might come up against in edit mode. So here's where we got up to last time, and I want to make the tower section of my castle. In order to do that I need my wall out of the way, so in the outliner I can press the I here, and that will hide it from my viewport. Remember, it's still visible in my render, not that that matters yet. And with my 3D cursor in the center, incidentally if it's not in the center you can hold down Shift S and move your mouse over cursor to world origin, and it will move your 3D cursor into the center. So for my towers I want them to be cylindrical, so I can press Shift A to add, mesh and then cylinder. Now before we make any changes to our object, we have a dialog box down the bottom here. I'll zoom in on my object with period key on the numpad, and you can see that it's got lots of faces around the edge, so if we wanted to make our crenellations, it's a bit more awkward with all these faces. Ideally we want about half this amount. I can come down to the bottom here and open up this dialog box, and this dialog box appears whenever you add a new object, and it has lots of parameters for this cylinder. At the moment the vertices around the cylinder is 32. We can halve that to 16, and that's a lot better for the size that we need. Everything else we can change quite easily in the viewport, but the vertex amount is much more tricky, so it's good to do that before you start editing it. As soon as I do start editing this, let's say I scale it down, this box disappears and it goes to the resize box instead, and we can't actually edit our cylinder anymore. So if you haven't reduced it to 16, you would have to delete this one and add it again. So pause the video, catch up with me and add a cylinder with 16 vertices around it. So I've scaled my cylinder down slightly, but that may not be necessary. Let's bring back my wall to see what sort of size I need to make it. So currently the cylinder is smaller than the wall, and actually we want it to be a lot taller. So I'll scale mine up so it's around about here, so not quite the full size, and then I'll scale in the Z axis as well, somewhere around there I think. Then I'll go to front view, and I want both of my objects really above the floor. That will make it much easier to model. So G then Z, and you can be fairly rough here, that's fine. Select the wall, G then Z, and move that above the floor there as well. And the tower now is about the right size I would say. We can easily adapt it later. So let's hide the wall module again and start editing our tower to make it more interesting. I think it would be nice if it actually had a kind of top to it, and then our crenellations going around the very top. So let's go into edit mode with tab. I'll need faces selected, so that's faces up here. Incidentally, you can press 1, 2 or 3 on your keyboard, and that will take you to vertices, edges and faces. So let's select that top face, and I'll zoom in on this. Now if I press E to extrude, I can pull out a new face like this, and then S to scale, I can scale it up, and we're starting to get a sort of tower now. I can then press E to extrude again to pull that up to maybe somewhere around here, and then I'm ready for my crenellations. So that's one extrusion and scaled up, and then another extrusion up a little bit higher. So pause the video and catch up with me with those two extrusions. So let's go round to the top now, and I need some sort of cut in here, so I've got some faces to pull out for each of these crenellations. Now what we can do is press E to extrude and then S to scale. So E to extrude, S to scale, and I can bring it in like this. That's created these faces around here which I can now use to extrude. Now before you do that yourself, I'll undo that because there's an easier command which is I to inset. It's the same as pressing E to extrude and S to scale, but it's one button. So that's a bit easier. And the tool for that is over here. You can see also that you've got lots of options here, which we don't need to change just at the moment. Now once again, I'm going to undo what I've done there, and I'm going to show you problems you might come up against. If I press E to extrude and left click, maybe for some reason I decided not to extrude at that point, but I left click by accident instead of pressing escape. If I go into X-ray mode now, which is much like wireframe but just see-through, and zoom in a bit, you can see that I actually have created a whole new set of faces around the outside. And that can cause lots of problems because the vertices and faces are right on top of each other, and it can get very confusing. Now obviously the easy way is just to undo these steps with Ctrl Z, but you may have done some modifications. Let's say if I press I now to inset, so I'm insetting that top face, like I said earlier, to somewhere like that. I've still got all these extra faces around the outside where you can see these dots here. I'll turn off X-ray mode now, and you'll notice you can just see an extra bit of thickness on these lines, but it's not really giving us any indication that something's wrong. So if you do come across these problems, then just have a look at wireframe or X-ray mode and you'll be able to spot them. The way to get rid of them is to go to vertex mode. You can select all your vertices with A, and you can see that in the select menu here, so all, and Alt A is to select none, and then we can press the M key for merge. You can also find this in the mesh menu, merge just there. So I'll press M again, and we want to merge vertices by distance. So I'll click on that, and you can see it's removed 16 vertices, it's telling me down there, and my distance is 0.0001. So very tiny, but because they were right on top of each other, it knew to get rid of them. So merge vertices is very useful if you get into some kind of trouble like described here. So I'll come back out of wireframe mode, deselect all with Alt-A, and I want you to catch up with me now in setting the top face. So go to face mode, select that top face and press I to inset to create this extra face loop that I've created here. Don't worry too much about the merging vertices at the moment, just be aware that that's how you get out of problems if you've got vertices on top of each other. So pause the video and create that inset.
No.
Okay, so now we want to select every other face going around like this, and we want to E to extrude and pull those upwards like so. Now you might just want to bring back your wall module and see the height of those so we get a similar crenellation height. I'll just go to X-ray mode for that so we can see it easily. And it's not bad, but I can press G then Z to move them down just a touch there. And back out of wireframe and hide my wall module again. And we've got a fairly nice looking tower turret there. The last thing I'd like to do is select this face and E to extrude and move it downwards, so that pulls it inside itself. So once again, pause the video, catch up with me and create the crenellations and extrude that middle face downwards to kind of push a section inside itself like that. Okay, so lastly, let's come out of edit mode and into object mode. Try and remember the keyboard shortcut for that.
Extrude, you'll see a little box.
So that's tab. Let's bring back my wall module, and I'm going to press G the next just to move my tower to the side slightly and make sure I'm happy with the overall sizes, and that looks reasonably good. I think my wall needs to be very slightly bigger to match with the crenellation size there. I'll go to front view and just make sure that's above the floor like this, and I think that's about right. It doesn't matter too much though. Lastly, let's select the cylinder and rename it to tower. That time I double clicked in the outliner, but remember you can press F2 as well. Okay, so make sure you're caught up with me, you've labelled your cylinder tower, and of course make sure you've saved your work ready for next time.
That's it. It's a model. Feel me? Pay attention now. We're almost
In this
done.
lecture, I'll be talking about the difference between flat and smooth shading, and showing how we can get hard edges and smooth edges on our objects. So here's where we got up to last time, and before building our castle I'd like to make this tower module a bit more smooth. Can you see how it's flat shaded around the sides here? We can actually make this look continuously smooth and more rounded. So in order to demonstrate this, I'll just hide the wall module for a moment with the eye in the outliner, and I'm going to add in a UV sphere. So Shift A to add, mesh, and UV sphere. And this will illustrate our point nicely, so I'll zoom into this, and incidentally you can see in this dialog box we can change the parameters of our UV sphere here in the same way as our cylinder, but you don't need to change the segments or rings for this. Now if I right click on the object, I get the object context menu, and within that there's shade smooth and shade flat. So if I click on shade smooth, it suddenly looks all smooth, which is really great. If I zoom in a little bit closer, you can see that it's still jaggedy on the edges, so it's still got the same face count. And if I go into wireframe mode, you can see those faces there, and back to solid. But in the way it's dealing with the shading across the shape, it's giving it a smooth gradient rather than the flat shading. So right click, there's shade flat, and right click, shade smooth. So quickly bring in a UV sphere and right click and shade smooth. Pause the video and have a go at that. Now the reason I brought in a UV sphere to do this is because there's no hard corners. However, with our tower shape over here, if I left click on that to select and right click, shade smooth, it's not bad, and it's smoothed out the areas around the cylinder, but it's also smoothed out the areas where I actually want hard edges. So smooth shading isn't completely foolproof, and we need some way to sharpen up these edges in here. What we can do is come down to this icon here, which is the object data properties, and scroll down to where it says normals. Now don't follow along with this bit, but if I go to edit mode with tab on my keyboard and go up to my overlays, I can show you what normals are. If I click on the face option here, it's showing me the face direction, which are known as normals. And I can also show you the edge direction like this as well. The direction your faces are facing, or the normals, can be quite important in 3D programs. We'll talk more about that later in the course, but it is handy to start thinking about it now. So I'll get rid of that menu. So in the object data property menu, we've got this option normals. And within that menu, we've got this option
Normies.
to smooth out the normals between the faces. It takes any edges that have got a certain angle, which is in this case 30 degrees, and makes them sharp. So if I go back to object
Cat
mode,
goes over
we can
this
see
lot,
that that's
too.
immediately sorted our shape out. Let's go back into edit mode
smooth.
and choose this edge going around here. So I'll go to edge mode over here, or press 2 on my keyboard, and you can select an edge loop going all the way around an object by holding down Alt and left clicking on one of your edges. If I press G to grab in the Z axis, so G then Z, and bring this down, as it goes past 30 degrees, it will go smooth. Can you see that point there is past that 30 degree angle? So as if there's an imaginary line carrying on there, that angle here would be 30 degrees. So G then Z, you can see it changing from sharp there to smooth. So depending on your angles, you might need to change this number, but generally speaking, 30 degrees is often a very useful number for making certain edges sharp. So I'll come back into object mode, I'll delete my sphere and bring back my wall,
So it's usually
and your
always 30
challenge is
degrees.
to catch up with me, selecting your tower, right click and shade smooth, and go to the object data properties, under normals, and tick on auto smooth. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time.
So you gotta be in object mode for
In this lecture we'll learn about the different types of duplication, and we'll start our castle structure. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. And before we start making our castle, it's a good idea to understand a little bit about
Still know
duplication.
about?
So for example, let's take the wall, and I'll move across slightly. And if I want to duplicate this, see if you can remember the command for duplicate. So that's
G?
Shift D, and then I can press X to move it in the X axis, and move it next to the other one like this.
What's replicate?
However, at this point I might want to make some changes to my original module. So let's say go into edit mode, G then Z, and move these crenellations up, but then I'd have to go back into object mode, select the next one along, and make changes there as well. Well, I'll undo that, and this time I'm going to duplicate this object with Alt D. So Alt D and then X, and I'll move it next to the other one. Now Alt D is a linked duplicate, and you can see that if you go under Object and down to Duplicate Objects, Shift D,
confusing, you
and
know,
then
you
Duplicate
just don't know
Linked
what replicate
with Alt
means
D.
for R.
Now if I go into Edit mode with this original one, or any one that's linked
Why
in
would you
fact,
do that?
and then E to extrude, you can see how it's updating on my linked duplicate. So I'll undo that and go back into object mode, and for the one that isn't linked, I can make that one a linked duplicate by selecting both of them, and the one selected last is the active object, so anything I copy will be taken from the active object. So any copies here will go from this one to that one. I can then press Ctrl L, the same way we did for copying the materials, and I can link object data. That will now make this one as well a linked duplicate to this one. So if I go into edit mode, G to grab in
Yeah, it
Z,
gets
you can
confusing.
see they all change. Okay, so I'll go back into object mode. What I'd like you to do is to catch up with me with 3 other wall modules, but use the Alt D command to make linked duplicates. If you've already made a duplicate, then you can always select the 2 and use the Ctrl L command
Why
to
do you
link them
use
together
replicate?
with object
Huh? Why do they
data.
have
So
to
pause
be
the video
linked?
and have a go at that. Okay, so what I want to do now is to make some minor alterations to add a bit of detail and just to utilize the
doesn't
fact that
go
we've
over
got
that.
linked duplicates here. So into edit mode, and what I'd like to do is make some extrusions here, but go into a point. So I'll press E to extrude in the Z axis to move these
Let's
upwards.
duplicate
Incidentally,
more
the normals
important
are
than
facing
replicate.
towards the Z axis, so when I press the Z key, it actually takes off the movement in the Z axis,
Explain
and then I
that
have to
right
press
now.
it again to turn it back on. So just be aware of that. You don't actually need to press the Z axis in this case when extruding
'Cause
along
I
the
would
Z
think
axis.
if they're
And I
linked,
think to
you
somewhere
try to move
around
one,
here, and
they're
now I
all
want to scale
fucking
them in,
pairing it.
and they're all
That's
going
what he's
inwards
trying to
towards
tell
each
you.
other, which does look kind of
Fucking
fun,
idiot.
but that's not what I want. I'll undo that. At the moment it's taking the middle point of all these 3 shapes and choosing that as its kind of origin point. What I need to do is change the transform pivot point up the top here. So if I click on this, median point is the default, so it's the median or middle point of everything that's selected. Instead I can change this to individual origins, and now when
You
I
might
press
have to
S
go
to scale,
back,
I can
go
bring it
replicate,
into a
'cause
point
you
like
can
this. Just be
duplicate
careful
them
not to go
all.
in on itself like this. So just down to a small
By
point
selecting
like
them.
this, and we've got some
Control
pointy
select.
crenellations now. And because they're linked duplicates, it updates on each of them. Just remember to change this
Yeah.
back to median point so it doesn't get too confusing. So your challenge then is to change these crenellations so they've got a more pointy structure, or anything that you think might look quite nice, but experiment with using individual origins and median point under the transform pivot
Individual
point.
origin
So
is
pause the video
R.
and have a go at that.
Replicate.
Okay, so I'm going to go back into object mode, and I think it's time we made our castle structure. I think it's best to go into top view for this, and I'll zoom out a bit. I can select my
can
walls
always
here and
carry
press
them
G to
later.
grab and move them in a bit closer. In fact, that's better in front view here with 1 on my numpad, G to grab in the X,
Right-click
and
to carry.
make sure it's sort of overlapping slightly. It's absolutely fine to have objects overlapping, that's not a problem. So let's go back to top view, and now I can start duplicating them and moving them about. So I can select these 3 objects here, Alt D to make a linked duplicate, and then rotate them around. Now just a quick note, if I undo that and come up to the top here and had it on individual origins, if I rotate now, it will
Okay,
rotate
that's
them
cool.
around their individual origins. So make sure you've got the transform pivot point set back to medium point. I'll rotate this around, move that to there, and I can make a simple castle structure by pressing Alt D and
No, I've never
duplicating
used
it.
that before, so
I can
that's
choose 1 wall or 3 walls between them, so I
I'm
can
gonna
have
lose
1
my
wall
mic
here
my
and rotate that
volume.
round, put it in
I'm
there.
gonna have to shut
So your challenge
up.
then is to build your
And
own
then
castle.
just let
If
me
you feel
down.
confident, then build the middle section, but I'll show you how
Or
to do
you'll
that
hear
in a moment
background
if not.
noise.
So pause the video and have a go at that.
Yeah.
So I'll continue making the rest of the castle. Copy this one, Alt D. Do remember to keep pressing Alt D and not Shift D, of course. That's in case we want to make any changes to all our objects at the same time.
Or just have
Let's select these,
Oh, okay.
Alt D, and rotate that around there. And I think I'll have an extra wall there. So one from over here, Alt D. Now if I look at this, it's got the crenellations in the wrong order. So I'll delete that one, and it's easier to get this one, Alt D, and then X in this case. And we're slowly building up a castle structure here. So these are the castle walls, and for the middle
Well, you gotta
castle
get
I
hard,
just
dude.
selected one of these, Alt D, brought it into the middle and scaled it up. On linked duplicates, anything you do in object mode, so rotation, movement or scaling, anything like that won't be updated on the originals. It's only when you go into edit mode that those changes
Damn
are
it.
updated on the
Tell 'em
originals.
about
So it's
the
important to
audio.
note if I want to change this structure in any way, like going into edit mode, and let's say I wanted to take this face here,
Yeah,
G
I
to
mean-
grab, it would change all of them. So if you want to change this at all, you'll need to press Shift D as your duplicate, but if you want it to be linked to all the other ones, then press Alt D. So I'll undo those changes there, back to top view, and I'll just copy
It's
these,
best to hear that,
so they're a big
you know,
castle in the
apparently,
middle there.
I would
I need a
think.
wall around the outside. And these don't link up so well, so I'll probably just take this one and rotate it slightly and get that to link a little bit closer. Maybe these ones here, move them out slightly, and just change it around as you see fit so it works together. I think I'll make this section a little bit longer, somewhere around there, as if there's sort of a courtyard.
Like this.
Here on my mic.
Lastly, some walls
For me.
inside here. So Alt D once again. And again with these walls you could press Shift D if you wanted to edit them in any way. I'm just going to press Alt D and keep it nice and simple. So these 4 walls here, they can be scaled up
it's not still not doing it. What the fuck? Just wanted to say, what the fuck? I don't know. It's just a monitor. No, maybe not. Maybe. Yeah, it'd have to be, man. Come on. Really? No? Look at it. Peg somewhere else? Damn it! Fuck it. That's what I say. Man, that should have worked, man. Mike, fuck. Mike, you too? It won't work that way, right?
Can't be that way.
No problem, Ray? No?
actually no material in there at the moment, but if I press assign, that should turn this white color, which is kind of the base color. So once again, under the slots, make sure that empty slot there is selected and press new material. I'll call this ground. Change that base color to a brown, so somewhere around there, and you can see those selected faces have now been given that ground material. So they've got slot 2 and the top has got slot 1. So if I deselect all with Alt A, I can actually come into my slots and let's say choose the grass and then select. That will select all those faces with the grass material. I'll deselect all again, and if I go to slot 2, I can select the faces with that brown material. So let's go back to object mode and see what we've got. We might want to modify these materials very slightly, so I don't think the shininess of the objects works particularly well, so I'll select one of my turrets and just make sure the roughness is nice and high. Same for the walls, although it doesn't make too much difference on the walls because they haven't got a smooth rounded edge. And the base is looking fairly nice. So colour the base with 2 separate colours, making the top a nice green colour and the bottom of the landscape a brown colour using the material slots. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, let's take a quick look at how that's going to render. So we'll go to the render preview here. It doesn't look great with only our light and a very grey background, so it would be nice to have an HDRI in the background. So pause the video here and see if you can remember how to add an HDRI to your scene. So hopefully you remember, you come down to the shader editor here and where it says object, we click on that and choose world. If you can't see your nodes, then make sure you press the home key, and we need an environment texture, an HDRI, to plug into our color. So I'll move those across a bit, Shift A to add, texture, environment texture, and put that at the beginning, and open up my HDRIs, and you can choose any that you like. I think this sort of environment's going to suit it nicely, and again, choose a suitable one from Polyhaven. I'll open that image and hook it up. And now we can see that in the background, and our lighting is a lot nicer. We don't really need this light anymore, so I can delete that. Now our render engine is still in Eevee. Let's see if we can make this look a little bit better by turning on screen space reflections. Not much has changed there, but we've got a little bit more reflection coming from the walls there, as you can see when I turn that off and on. We can also try the ambient occlusion. If I tick that and open up that box, the ambient occlusion is the amount of shading that happens within the crevices. So that's where Cycles is quite realistic, the light bounces around and it doesn't go right into the corners. But Eevee isn't doing that at the moment, and we can fake it with this distance slider for the ambient occlusion, and when I bring that up, you can see it adds a little bit of that ambient occlusion into those crevices. It is faked ambient occlusion, so it isn't brilliant, but it's pretty decent. So experimenting with the distance slider, you can see you get different results, and it's not making much difference after about 5, I would say. So that's a good number for me. It will depend on the size of your scene. So if I click on one of my objects and press N on the tool panel, you can see the dimensions of this object. It's very big, being 6.5 meters tall, so we need a distance that's quite high in meters as well. I'll press N to get rid of that panel. So pause the video and turn on the screen space reflections and play with the ambient occlusion a little bit. and see what you come up with. Let's quickly take a look at cycles. So I'll change my render engine to cycles and see how that looks. And once again, you can see it's a lot more realistic and much nicer. I'll change my device to my GPU and I'll turn on the denoise for the viewport, and it updates almost as quick as Eevee. So again, there's the difference between Eevee and cycles. I'll turn back to Eevee though. One more thing I think it's worth doing is clicking on the base, and we've got this sort of blocky flat shading. Pause the video and see if you can remember how to change that to smooth shading. So hopefully you remembered, right click, shade smooth. That does mean we get smooth shading around the edges here. So we can come down to our object data properties, and under the normals, we change that to auto smooth, and that sharpens them up. And that's looking quite nice now. So hopefully you got on okay with that. Do make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture we'll be creating some turrets and some flag and flagpoles. So here's roughly where we got up to last time, but what I've done is I've created 2 extra castle turrets that stick out the top here on the back side of the castle, and as a challenge to you, I'd like you to see if you can model those. So they're fairly basic shapes, as you can see there. So pause the video here and have a go at that. Okay, so what I'll do, I'll delete both of those and I'll start afresh. So I'll shift right click to move my 3D cursor, shift A to add, mesh and then cylinder, and I change the vertex count to 16, and I think that looks about right. I can go to top view and position it a bit more closely, so somewhere around there, and then scale, but shift Z so it doesn't scale in the Z axis, so it's a bit thinner, G then Z to move it up a bit, and then into edit mode to create this sort of cone-like top shape. I'm in face mode at the moment, so that's 3 to go to face mode. Select that top face, E to extrude, and then S to scale straight away, and I can extrude out this extra section here, and then E to extrude again, and then bring it upwards. I can also press S, then 0 to scale that face right down into a single point. Now I think it needs to go a bit higher. It is still selected, but if you're unsure, you can go to wireframe and select that top face like that, or it might be easier to grab all the vertices at the top like that together. I'll talk about how we can merge them in a moment. I'll go back to solid mode and then press G then Z to move that upwards a bit. So we've got a sort of castle turret on our towers. Let's go back to object mode, and I need to smooth this out. So first of all, right click, shade smooth. We get those sort of smoothing anomalies, so I'll need to come down to the object data properties down here, into the normals, and tick on auto smooth. Now that's a lot better, but we've still got these slight anomalies coming up here. So I'll quickly go back into edit mode, and I've got that top vertex selected there, but it's actually lots of vertices because I took that face and scaled it right down. So there's all these vertices, 16 to be precise, that are just on top of each other here. So a way I can merge them is by pressing M to merge, and then by distance. And you can see I've removed 15 vertices down the bottom here. So I'm left with one vertex, which is the 16th. You've also got a merge distance option down here, but because they're right on top of each other, we don't have to worry too much about that. So now I've got a single vertex up the top here. When I go back into object mode, you can see it's smoothed out and it hasn't got those strange shading anomalies. So once we've done that, I'll go to top view. I can either press Shift D or Alt D at this point. Alt D makes more sense because they're going to be precisely the same, and move that across to the other side. And there we have our turrets on our towers. So hopefully you got on okay with that. If you haven't, then do pause the video and catch up with me. The next thing that would be nice to make is a flagpole off the top of our turrets. So I'll select that object and press full stop or period key on my numpad, come right up to the top here and shift right click to move my 3D cursor to the top. Shift A to add, and once again I can add a cylinder. If we were modelling this for a game and I wanted to be really efficient, I don't really need 16 vertices going around my cylinder because it's very thin. You can get away with 5 or 6. So if I bring it down to 6, it looks very blocky at the moment, but when I scale it down and then scale in the Z axis and scale Shift Z so it doesn't scale in the Z, you can see it looks much more cylindrical now. And when I select it again, right click and shade smooth, you can see you don't really notice that it's only got 6 sides. I'll just go to top view and get that a little bit more precise. Actually, top view is not that great, but it doesn't matter too much. I'll just move it into position by eye. You could of course go to wireframe mode to find the exact position, but there's no need. But somewhere around there looks good. I'll press G then Z to move it up a little bit, and there we've got our flagpole. Now I want an actual sort of material flag coming out here. So the 3D cursor is positioned fine. I'll just press Shift A to add, mesh and then plane. I'll rotate that in the X-axis, so that's the red one going across there, 90 degrees. And let's go to front view and start lining this up by scaling it down and just moving it into position there. I'll scale in the Z a little bit more. Okay, now I can go into edit mode. I'll select this end edge here and just press G to grab and move it in the X-axis so it's a nice long flag like this. I could of course just as easily have done that in object mode, it doesn't matter too much. And now I can press Ctrl R and do, let's say, 3 loop cuts using my mouse wheel to add a few more. I'll also do one more going across the middle like this. So that's Ctrl R and double left click. And let's bring these two out slightly, so G then X, and we've got one of those sort of, I don't know what sort of flags you call them, but one of those sort of flags. Now we need it to wave in the wind slightly, so I'll use my proportional edit tool. I'll go to edge mode, and if I alt left click I can select these edge loops like this, and I'll press G then Y, and I'll use my wheel to bring down the circle of influence slightly. Alt left click on this one, G then Y, move that over here, and maybe G then Z to move it down a bit, and this one G then Z to move it up a bit. And we've got a sort of flag waving in the wind. It's probably a little bit too extreme, so I'll just move that back this way and move this one this way slightly, so it's a little bit less violent, the wind. And let's just reposition it again by selecting it all in object mode, G then Y, and moving it back into position. And we've got our flag on our flagpole there. Let's just move it down a touch as well, about there. I can now select both these two, and I could press Alt D, but I might want to change the flag very slightly for the second one, so I'll just press Shift D this time, and then Y to move it in the Y axis, and I think we're about right there. Let's zoom in on that with period key, and just move it over the top of the other one. Again, you could go to top view and wireframe to see that top vertex, but I'm pretty much there, and that's fine. Then back into my flag, and let's start just playing with the shape slightly. And maybe I'll press R to rotate on this one and G to grab on this one. So it's just a little bit different like that. And they're both going exactly the same way. So maybe I'll go to top view and just rotate that around a little bit. This one here, can just see it there, and rotate that one slightly. Just got to make sure that it stays on top of your flagpole, that's the only thing. And there we go, we've got our castle with some flags. So your last challenge here is to catch up with me and complete your flags. Give them a simple material and maybe add some different shaped turrets to another part of the castle somewhere. Just experiment, see how you get on. Don't worry if it goes wrong, it's all about getting used to the tools. And once you've finished that, do make sure you've shared it with the community and check out how other people are getting on. And of course, do make sure you've saved your work. So now you've made your castle, you might want to practice adding some of your own objects to the scene, like maybe a moat or a drawbridge. It's really good to extend your learning by doing your own adaptations of the things we learned together. However, if you find you're getting stuck, then you may want to just move on to the next section where we go through more techniques that will boost your abilities, and then maybe you can come back to the castle and model even more things. As always, share your work with the community, as it's really great to get feedback from different people. In this next section, we'll be working on this spooky corridor scene. The focus of this is thinking about texturing, which is adding materials or textures to our objects. This is very important when we're trying to make our objects look more realistic, and we can use photographs taken from real life of different real life materials such as walls and floors and place them onto our objects. As always, we'll be keeping it fairly simple to start with, but later on we'll be adding more detailed textures that interact with light in a special way to make them even more realistic. So let's make our spooky corridor together. In this lecture, we're going to learn the basics of UV mapping, which is how to put or map any texture onto any 3D object. So I'm back in the general startup file, and in order to show UV mapping, let's go to the UV editing workspace. Now you can see our default cube here, and we've been put into edit mode. I'll zoom in on that, and you can see it's UV map here. So each of these faces is a face of our default cube. So if I get a flat texture in here, these areas of the image will appear on the face of the cube. So it's taking the 3D information from the cube and flattening it out into a 2D representation. So let's get an image in here. In order to do that, I'm going to bring out a new window. So I'll come up to the top here where my cursor changes to the crosshairs, click and drag to bring down a new window. Remember, at any time you can always create a new one of these under General, UV Editing, and delete the old one if your workspace becomes a mess. I want to change this to the shader editor, so I'll come to the top left hand corner here and click on this icon and go to the shader editor. I don't need this menu over here, so I'll press N to get rid of that menu and zoom in so I can see mainly my color area, because that's where we'll be plugging a texture into. Now Blender can create textures. If I come down to my UV editing workspace, and incidentally, if you want to move across these panels, if you've not got enough space, you can middle mouse button over that panel and move side to side, and I can press this new option here, and that will say what sort of image do I want to create. I'll name it UV grid, and under generate type I'm going to change that to a color grid. Because that's where we'll be plugging a texture in here. These areas of the image will appear on the face of the cube. So it's taking the 3D information from the cube and flattening it out into a 2D representation. So let's get an image in here. In order to do that, I'm going to bring out a new window. So I'll come up to the top here where my cursor changes to the crosshairs, click and drag to bring down a new window. window. Remember, at any time you can always create a new one of these under General, UV Editing, and delete the old one if your workspace becomes a mess. I want to change this to the shader editor, so I'll come to the top left hand corner here and click on this icon and go to the shader editor. I don't need this menu over here, so I'll press N to get rid of that menu and zoom in so I can see mainly my color area, because that's where we'll be plugging a texture into. Now Blender can create textures. If I come down to my UV editing workspace, and incidentally, if you want to move across these panels, if you've not got enough space, you can middle mouse button over that panel and move side to side, and I can press this new option here, and that will say what sort of image do I want to create. I'll name it UV grid, and under generate type I'm going to change that to a color grid and press OK. That creates this color grid. If I zoom out you can see that, and my UV map is on top of this image. We can't see anything yet on our cube because firstly we need to attach it to our principled BSDF, but quickly pause the video here and create a UV grid for yourself. Editing and delete the old one if your workspace becomes a mess. I want to change the window, so I'll come up to the top here where my cursor changes to the crosshairs, click and drag to bring down a new window. Remember, at any time you can always create a new one of these under General, UV Editing, and delete the old one if your workspace becomes a mess. I want to change this to the shader editor, so I'll come to the top left hand corner here and click on this icon and go to the shader editor. I don't need this menu over here, so I'll press N to get rid of that menu and zoom in so I can see mainly my color area, because that's where we'll be plugging a texture into. Now Blender can create textures. If I come down to my UV editing workspace, and incidentally, if you want to move across these panels, if you've not got enough space, you can middle mouse button over that panel and move side to side, and I can press this new option here, and that will say what sort of image do I want to create. I'll name it UV grid, and under generate type I'm going to change that to a color grid and press OK. That creates this color grid. If I zoom out you can see that, and my UV map is on top of this image. We can't see anything yet on our cube because firstly we need to attach it to our principled BSDF, but quickly pause the video here and create a UV grid for yourself. Let's now attach it up. So with my mouse over the shader editor, Shift A to add, texture, image texture, and that creates an image texture node. I can then hook that up to the base color, and I have to say which image do I want to use. I'll zoom in on that just a touch, and I'll click on this drop down here. There's the UV grid, which is in Blender's memory at the moment that we've just created, and I'll click on that. There's my UV grid. Again, we can't see it in our viewport yet because I need to come up to the top here and to our render options and change it to material preview mode or rendered mode. Now we can see the corresponding numbers and letters on our UV grid and how they're sitting on this single texture. So I'll make this window bigger by coming in between the two windows, clicking and dragging and pulling that up, and use my wheel to zoom in. And I'll come back to the left hand side of this menu and I'm going to use these options here. So this is much like edit mode. We've got vertices, edges and faces, but we've also got a new one called islands. I'll talk about islands a little bit later on, but for the moment I can select some vertices here, press G to grab, and you can see that that's moving where this face's mapping is, and therefore changing which part of the image is shown on this face of the cube. I'll undo that though, and it's time for you to catch up with me and hook up your UV grid or color grid to the principled BSDF just like I've done here. Now a problem is when I'm selecting these vertices I don't know which ones on the object I'm choosing. There's an option up here which is UV sync selection. When I have this turned on, anything I select in here you can see is selected on my object. Let's go to face mode because that's a bit easier. Now I can start selecting faces and you can see that face selected up there and start to tell which face is which. So let's find the one that's facing me. I can see there's an F4 there, so let's choose F4 here, and that's the one facing me. If I press G to grab now, I can move that to a different part of the grid, and it's actually separating it from the other ones. And I can select any of these faces, so there's H4 there, select that one and move it to a different part of the grid. It can overlap the other one as well, so this has both got C7 and the corresponding numbers around it, and I could actually put all these cubes into the same spot and they've all got that sort of C7 texture on each face. And I can select them all now and move them about, and you can see them all moving at the same time to different areas across the grid. Okay, so hopefully this is making sense to you. So you might want to pause the video here and move your faces around into different positions just to get an idea of what's happening and the relationship between the UV editor and our 3D objects. Okay, so what about more complicated objects? Well, I'll come to object mode with tab, select my default cube and delete it, shift A to add, mesh, and let's choose the monkey. So let's see how it works on slightly more complicated objects. So the monkey hasn't got a material at the moment. You can see if I come up to here, to our shader editor, there's nothing shown and it's just the add new option. Well, I can come across to this option here and choose my default material that was on the cube. So I'll choose that and we can see instantly that this object is covered in our UV grid. Now, if I go into edit mode now, I'll just clear the background for the moment. So I'll close that down and zoom in again. And you can see the default UV map for this object. So this object has been cut up already and has a UV map on it. I can see that in the object data properties here under UV maps, and there's a UV map just there. If I delete that now, don't follow along with me, it will clear that texture because it doesn't know where to put it on my object. So a lot of the time when you're creating a complex object of your own, you will need to create a UV map, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. I'll undo that step though. So the monkey comes with this default map, and with link selection enabled, I can see anything I select in here will be selected in our main viewport. So that's the left eye here, or the right eye for the monkey, the other eye, these ones here are the ears, and all this is the whole face. And you can see a distinct change in the texture where this line down the middle here, and that line corresponds to the outside of this shape. We can see that more easily if I show the seams on my monkey. In order to do that, I need to select everything in here. So with my mouse over the UV editor, tap A to select all. Then I can come up to UV and seams from islands. And the islands are the big joined together areas in the UV map. When I mark those seams, you can see we've now got a red line going around our object. I'll just deselect all because it's a bit easier to see then. So this red line is the outside of this UV island here. Now if I go to edge mode with 2 and select a few edges down here, you can see this edge is joined to this edge over here. It's kind of like someone's squashed the face and flattened it out. So if I alt left click on this, you can see it going almost all the way around until it hits a triangle, of course. And I'll control select these ones because they're not part of the seam, but you can see it there going all the way around. And I'll get rid of those ones as well. And where that's going all the way around, you can see the texture change. Let's see the texture again in the background. So I'll click on the down arrow here, choose the UV grid, and let's choose a face this time. I'll choose this one here. I can press the period key on my numpad to zoom in on that face. So that's at the front here. And you can see it's got no number on it because it's next to D7. But if I press G to grab, move it over to D8 or something, you can see that move there. I'll undo that though. And let's take this one here, which is just around the corner here. That's part of D7 and you can see just the edge of the D there. And like I say, you can see a very clear distinction where the seams are. And that's often why when people are marking out seams for their objects, turning the 3D shape into a 2D flat object, they try and hide these seams as best as possible because you do get a distinct change in the material. So pause the video here and take a moment to catch up with me, adding in a monkey and adding the material that has the grid on to the monkey so you can see that texture on top of the object. So I'll bring down the UV image editor now and come to our shader editor, and let's change this texture to an actual image. So I'm going to open up an image with open image here, and if you're following along with me, then choose any random image you have on your hard drive. If you want to see the images in your folders, make sure you go to display thumbnails up the top here, and I'll choose this brick wall here and open that up, and you can see immediately that's put it onto my monkey and it's spread around all over the place. It looks rather odd. And let's zoom out just a touch of my UV grid and change the image again within this drop down menu because I've already loaded it into the shader editor, and see how my UVs are spread across. So let's select this bottom island here. And incidentally, in UV sync selection, I can't choose islands. If I turn it off, I can choose islands over the far right here, but when the sync selection is on, you can't choose islands. There is a reason for that, but it's not important to explain it now. So I've got my middle face selected, and I can press G to grab and move that around my object, and you can see it moving around the bricks. I could even scale it up and go outside the borders of my object, and that will kind of repeat the texture. So it'll be as if there's a texture here put onto the side here, so all this that's going off the edge will actually come back onto the edge this side. So we should see some sort of repetition in our texture somewhere. This is slightly easier to see in Shade Smooth. So I'll go to Object Mode, right click, Shade Smooth, and we can see the texture repeat just here and along here. It's not that easy to see, but you can start to see that. Let's go back into Edit Mode and I'll scale it up even more, and we should be able to see it a bit more obviously. Back into Object Mode to see it nice and clearly, and we can start to see some repetition around these areas around here. So yes, you can resize your islands and make them really big, which actually makes the texture on the object quite small, but the texture will repeat and you'll see the edge of the texture. So your challenge then is to try the same thing with a UV sphere, a torus and a cone. Have a look at how they're unwrapped, move the faces about a bit, try things out, and maybe try some different image textures just to see what images look like on these 3D objects and where they're placed. Do make sure if you want to save your work, but you don't need it for the next lecture. In this lecture we'll be making a spooky corridor and we'll be unwrapping the walls, ceiling and floor and adding textures to them. So I'm in the general startup file, and in order to make our corridor we can use the default cube in the center here. So I'll select that and I'll press N on my keyboard and get the item properties up so you can see my dimensions. We can actually type them in. So generally speaking, a door is around 2 meters tall, and sometimes corridors are a bit taller than that, so 2.3 is a good size. We want a nice long corridor, so something like 10 meters. And I'll come around to the front and we'll think about the x-axis here. I think something like 1.8, so a fairly narrow corridor like this. It does help slightly to follow real-world dimensions with your objects, because certain things like the lights and their wattage will be impacted by the size of the world around it. So if you want accurate readings for your lights, you'll want accurate readings for your size and measurements. And that's true for a few other things within Blender as well. So quickly pause the video and catch up with me making a corridor. It doesn't have to have precisely the same measurements, but something close to mine is great. Okay, so now I want to remove this front face here so I can kind of see into my corridor. So I'll go into Edit Mode with Tab, or I can come up to the top here and go to Edit Mode, and I want to go to Face Mode as well. 3 on my keyboard for Face Mode, or Face Mode up here. Select that front face and press Delete and then Faces. So there we have our corridor. I'll come around to the front here so we can kind of see inside it. Now there is one thing to slightly be aware of here. We are looking at the inside faces of our object. Now that makes a lot of difference if you're in something like a game engine. Often they don't render the back faces or inside faces of objects, as that takes more processing power. And that's called back face culling. You can actually see this in Blender. If you come up to your viewport shading at the top right, and this down arrow just here, you've got back face culling here. And you can see we can only now see it from this side, and we see through our objects when we see the back faces, just like most game engines. Some people like to have this set all the time, especially if they're going from Blender to a game engine. We can also see the face direction under the overlays, so if I click this drop down here, we've got face orientation there, and anything in blue is the correct side, and if I turn off back face culling now, you can see anything in red is the wrong way round. We can reverse this by selecting everything with A, and then pressing Shift N, which recalculates the normals. That's also found under the Mesh menu, Normals, and then Recalculate. And there's a Recalculate Outside and Recalculate Inside. You can find the Recalculate Inside button here, and that flips my faces around. Now none of this will matter in our scene at the moment, but it can be important for more complex modelling later on. So it's good to have some general understanding of this, but like I say, not essential for the moment. So I'll turn off Face Orientation View, So under overlays and face orientation, turn that off. And let's deselect all, come around to the front and think about our scene. Now we can add a material to each of these faces with material slots, but it can kind of get a bit confusing when you're UV unwrapping as well. So it's much easier if we separate out each of the faces. So in edit mode with faces selected, I can select on a face, press P for separate, that's how I like to remember it, and then separate by selection. That will make that a new object. So I can go to each of my faces, P, separate by selection, and just keep doing that for each face. Now if I press tab to jump back into object mode, I can select each of these as individual objects. So pause the video and separate your faces out. Remember, you need to be in edit mode for that, and press P to separate. So now I'll go across to the shading workspace. I'll bring out these side windows here, push the bottom up a bit, and I want to change this window from the image editor to the UV image editor. So I can change that up the top left here, and at the moment it's image editor, we want UV editor. And I'll just zoom in a little bit on that. Come around to the front of my corridor, and seeing as I've got the floor selected, let's find a material for our floor. Now a great place for materials is textures.com. You do have to sign up, but when you sign up you get 15 free credits, and you get that each day. The good thing about this is we have permission to use the textures within our games and within our renders, and you would still be allowed to sell the game and use those textures. Do of course check the licensing in case anything has changed since this lecture. But I can search in the library for something like concrete. The first thing you often see are these spheres, but we just want single images, so you can just scroll down. We'll talk about using these spheres, which are PBR materials, later on, but for now just scroll down until you get some single images like these. And we're looking for a sort of grimy basement, so we want some sort of dirty concrete. And you can of course experiment with these things and try different ones out. I think this one here is a nice simple one, so I'll use that. I'll go for the slightly bigger size with 2 credits, but it won't make too much difference while we're just testing things out. So I'll download that. So pause the video here and maybe download a few textures for the walls and ceiling as well. Okay, so I'm back in Blender. The useful thing about having this folder open here, if I press the T key, I can navigate to my textures folder nice and easily, and I've got all my textures that I've downloaded in here, and that looks to be the texture that I'm after. But before I drag that in, we need to quickly think about the material. So obviously I've got a material here with my principled BSDF that comes with the default cube, but all these objects are sharing that material because they were all joined at one point. So with my floor, it'll be a good idea to create a new material over here, and I'll call this concrete. So now I'll drag my texture into my shader editor, and that brings it in as a texture node. So it does make it a bit quicker when you have your file manager over here. I'll then hook that up, and immediately it is showing on the floor. It's not awful, but it's very stretched. So let's go into edit mode to look at our UVs. I'll select that face, I'll zoom out of my image, and there's my face just there. Let's go to face mode and select that. Press G to grab and move it around, and you can see it moving in my window. So I'll scale this up so it covers almost the whole image. And now it looks like our floor is working in the UV image editor, but it looks very stretched in our scene. If I press / on my numpad, which will go into local view, or you can go up to view and go to local view here, you can see it does seem to be quite stretched. So let's scale this in the x-axis, so S then X in the UVs, and you can see it's actually stretching the wrong way, as it were. So what's happened is it's unwrapped, and although this looks like the same length as this down here, we need to rotate this so it's angled the right way. So if I come over to my image editor, press R90, so rotate 90 degrees. We don't need to say an axis because there is only one. We can now scale this in the Y and then scale in the X, and now we're getting what should be our concrete floor correctly proportioned. So I'll press / again to come out of local view, and now we can start thinking about the other walls. So pause the video and catch up with me if you haven't already by giving your floor a new material, add the concrete texture, and make sure your UV map is positioned in the correct location. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so let's just quickly take a look at a wall material now. So I'll come back out of edit mode, select the wall, back into edit mode, and select that face. Now you can see the UVs down here. It's on a blank background because we've got no image in our shader editor. Now because we used a basic cube primitive, it's already got a UV map on it. So let's go to our object data properties and just quickly see that there's a UV map just there. And like I said before, we can get rid of that UV map. So I'm going to do that just to show you how you get a UV map in case you haven't got one already. Well, in edit mode, we press U, and we've got lots of different options. We'll just use the unwrap option, and you can see it's unwrapped that wall as a big square like this. The interesting thing is it's used a square instead of a rectangle like this. That's because if I go back into object mode and press N on my keyboard, it doesn't take into account the scale that we've used here. It disregards this scale when you're in edit mode and you unwrap, hence why it came out as a square. If you wanted to take this into account, then you have to set this to 1. We can do that by pressing Ctrl A and applying the scale, and that's set it all to 1. Again, it doesn't really matter too much at this stage whether it's all set to 1 or not, because you can easily adapt the UV map. But if I go into edit mode now, come around to the front again here, and press U to unwrap, and unwrap, you can see it's the correct proportions. So applying our scale means that when we're in edit mode and unwrap, it will have the same kind of dimensions. So I'll create a new material for this. I'll call it wall. I'll find a wall texture, and you can download one from textures.com. Incidentally, if you want to search for a texture because you've got lots, you can just type it into the search bar. I'm going to use plaster damaged 105. I'll click and drag that in, and you can see that there. I can resize my UV map a bit, so scale in the Y a bit, G then Z, move it up, and find a nice area within my wall that I like the look of. Have a quick think why it's not appearing in my viewport. That's because I haven't hooked up the colour to the base colour just there. And now it's appearing. Let's have a quick look, and it looks great. So pause the video and catch up with me putting a wall texture onto your wall. I'll press N now to get rid of my panel, and I want to copy this material onto the other wall. Pause the video here and see if you can remember how to copy a material from one object to another. So I need to be in object mode, and I need to select the other wall, but that's the active object at the moment because it's highlighted yellow, so I can select the original one that I want to copy from last, so that's now the active object. Of course I could have just selected them this way round, but I want to show you can change the active object by making sure you click on the one you want to copy from last. Then Ctrl L and link materials. Now it's appeared all stretched. That again is because we need to remap the UVs, so I'll select that one, into edit mode, select that face, so select all with A, and we can see it down here. So first of all I'll scale in the X, see what sort of rotation we've got, and it's the wrong way round, so let's R90, so it's that way round now. I'll move it into a slightly different position from the other one so they're not precisely the same, and then I'll scale in the X this way, and we can see that's working nicely. And they look like two different walls because I've used a different position of this texture over here. So as your final challenge then, texture the other parts of the corridor, the end wall, with just a wall texture for now. We'll add in a door later on, and the ceiling with a different type of texture as well. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll come into object mode, select my ceiling, give it a new material, find some kind of texture. I'm using plaster dirty 0316. Hook it up into edit mode and select it. Select my UVs, I'll scale in the X to see which way round I am, and I need to rotate it again, so R90. Remember, I could apply the scale to this object, but I don't really need to do it as I can adapt it in the UV editor. Scale in the X and move that somewhere like here. Back into object mode and select the wall at the end, which I could actually copy from one of the walls at the side, so I'll do that. It doesn't matter if you've chosen a different material, but I'll select that, select one of these ones last, Ctrl L to link material, and go in and just edit the shape and edit how that's displayed, and I'll rotate it 90 degrees so it's the right way round. And now we have the start of our dingy corridor. So hopefully you got on okay with that. Do make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture we'll learn about the mirror modifier, and we'll be practicing positioning UVs and unwrapping. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and to create our door at the end of the corridor it will be a bit easier in the layout workspace, so we'll tick on that. I'll make sure my 3D cursor is at the end of the corridor by shift right clicking and shift A to add, mesh and cube. To position this I'll go to front view and I'll use X-ray mode, you can use wireframe as well, and I'll scale this a bit in the X, move it into position, and doors are around 2 meters, so we can keep the 2 meter in the Z axis there. Let's go around to side view with 3, move across and scale in the Y, so it's about 10 centimeters, and I could even type that in as 0.1. I'll zoom in just a touch and bring it forward just a little bit to around about there. We don't really have to worry about the other side at all, but we do want it overlapping slightly so there's no gap. Okay, so we've got our door there. So pause the video here and make sure you've got a door which is a similar size to mine. It doesn't have to be precise, but something close. I'll go into local view now with / on my numpad, and I'll work on the door frame first, and this will be symmetrical along the x-axis. So this side is the same as this one. And often you'll find yourself modeling items that are symmetrical, and it's really good to use what's called the mirror modifier, so you only have to model half your shape. The modifier can be found under the modifier properties here. And if I click on add modifier, you can see all the different modifiers we can use to adjust our shapes. Some will modify, some will generate new geometry, some will deform the geometry, and then you've got physics modifiers as well. The mirror is right in the middle here, so I'll click on that, and you can see that nothing has changed. That's because it's taking the entire shape and mirroring it on itself. So there's actually kind of two shapes on top of each other here. So if I go into edit mode with tab and press G to grab, you can see that there's the two shapes on top of each other, and they mirror around the origin point here along the x-axis. So the axis here is the x-axis. If I were to tick the z-axis and zoom out just a touch, you can see it's mirroring from about this point, but it's overlapping itself in the middle. So if I press G then Z, you can see these two overlapping themselves like this. And I could do the same with the Y. I'll undo those movements though, and turn off the z-axis. There is an option to bisect the shape. That can be a bit confusing for beginners, I find. So we'll kind of do that step manually. What we'll need to do is cut our shape in half and delete half of it so the mirror doesn't overlap itself. So to cut our shape in half, we can do a loop cut down the middle with Ctrl R, double left click. I'll go to face mode, select half my shape and press delete, and then faces. Now even though I've deleted that, you can see it's still there, and that's the mirror modifier. If I turn this modifier on and off, so this is showing the modifier in the viewport, I can tick that and you can see there's half my shape, and if I select it again, the mirror activates and it mirrors across to the other side. And if I select all my faces and press G to grab, you can see the two halves there, and if I come over the middle, they'll overlap each other like this. So I'll undo that. So pause the video here and catch up with me, add the mirror modifier, go into edit mode, cut your shape down the middle with a loop cut and delete half of it. You should find with the mirror modifier on the x-axis that you still have a full shape like I have here. So pause the video and have a go at that. There's a useful option here as well called clipping. If I tick that and press G to grab, I can't actually separate my objects and they won't overlap each other. That means they are actually being clipped together in the middle. So these vertices and edges are being stuck together in the middle, so I can't overlap myself. So that stops the overlapping process. However, if I untick that, press G to grab in the X, I can overlap them. If I tick it now, they are actually overlapped, so it won't move my geometry. However, if I press G then X with that enabled, when they meet, they stick together. Can you see them sticking together and going apart? So I'll leave them sticking together there, and then when I press G to grab again, they're completely stuck together. I'll undo those changes though, so we've got the same size shape, but it's often the case to have clipping turned on so that your mesh sticks together in the middle. But it won't actually make any difference to us at the moment. So now I can come to front view, Ctrl R to do a cut down the middle here, left click once, and then I can position it around here, which is going to be the frame of my door, and left click again, and one more across the middle here, so left click once, move it up to the top, so it's a similar size, and left click again. So pause the video and put in the loop cuts for the door surround. So I've got my frame outlined there, and now I can get rid of this face in here and join the edges up in the middle here. So let's go to face mode, and I want to get rid of this face, and don't forget the one at the bottom here as well. However, one of these faces would be very useful to have for the size of the door, because it already fits into that gap. So like we did with our original corridor, we can separate this and use it for the basis of our door. So can you remember the keyboard command for separate? So that's P on your keyboard, and I can separate selection. Now that middle face there is now a separate object. I can delete the other two faces that I don't want, so I'll select both those and press delete, and then faces. Let's turn off X-ray mode for now, so we can see what we've got. So we've got these empty spaces inside here, and a separate object, which is our door. So pause the video here, catch up with me, and create a separate face for the door by separating it from the main object. So I'll go back into object mode, and now we have two objects in local view. I'll come back out of local view with / so we can see our two objects, and I want to finish off my door frame. So I'll select that, go back into local view, so I've only got that visible, and I need to fill in the gaps. So tab into edit mode. Notice I can't select this side, That's because that's the mirrored side, so I can only work on the one side. So I can select faces over here. So I need to somehow join this edge to this edge. So let's go to edge mode, select this edge, shift select this edge, and press F to fill. That's also under the face menu. You've got fill just there. And I can do the same for the top edges here, this one and this one, F to fill. And there I have my door frame. So pause the video here and fill in the faces for your door frame. Okay, let's go back into object mode with tab and out of local view, and let's select the door. Now for the door, it hasn't got any thickness, but that's absolutely fine. We don't need any thickness for the door. I do want it to come back from the frame slightly, so G then Y, move it back, but I must just be careful that it doesn't overlap my other wall mesh just there, which you might find easier if we go to material preview mode, because we can see that texture. And now if I press G then Y, I move it about, and if you hold down shift you can move it in smaller increments. We want it just above the wall like that. So there's an indentation for our door frame, but it is above the wall. There we go, we've now got the door frame and the door ready for texturing. So as a challenge to you, try and find a door that you like the look of on textures.com and add that texture to your door. Don't worry about mapping the UVs just yet, because we have to apply the mirror, which I'll talk about in a moment. So pause the video and add that texture in. Okay, so for that I'm going across to the shading workspace. With my door selected, I want to create a new material. So new material here, and I'll call this door. I'll come across to my file browser with my texture folder and search for door. I've got this nice metal door here, so I'll drag that into my material, hook up the color to the color, and immediately we can see some result here. I'll zoom in on this with period key on my numpad and see what we've got. And I'll go into edit mode, select all, which at the moment is only 1/2 because it's being mirrored to the other side, which we can see there. So hopefully you managed to get up to this point here. Let's select our texture and start moving it about into position, and first start scaling it to see if we're the right direction. I'm scaling in the Y at the moment, but it's actually scaling the X. So again, we have to R90 to rotate it round. And the first thing you should notice is that it has a mirror on it. So I can reposition this a bit, but I'm always going to get a perfect mirror across to the other side. So what we need to do is apply the mirror to this object so that it becomes two faces, and we can position those on our texture. So if I go across to the modifiers, to apply modifiers you come up to this drop down menu here, and the command is Control A. However, if I try and click that, it says you can't from edit mode, so go back to object mode and then try and apply that, and we can now. Back into edit mode, and you can see I've got two faces. If I go into face mode with 3, I can select both of those, and they're at the moment right on top of each other. I could press G to grab and try and move them into position, but what's much easier, if I undo that, is to select them both and unwrap them once again. So unwrap, and there they both are, the wrong way round of course, R then 90, and then I can start scaling and positioning it. Scale in the Y here, and just move them to one side of this door, somewhere around there. So when I applied the mirror, it created a whole new face on the other side and made it a complete object once again. So make sure you're caught up with me and you've applied the mirror to your object. Make sure you do that in object mode, and it's best to re-unwrap at that point. So back into edit mode, select your faces, press U to unwrap, then you can start repositioning your UVs over your door texture. Once you've done that, make sure you save your work, ready for next time.
Or some shit, maybe. I don't know. There. Fine. Fuck it. This thing's a piece of shit. That's what it is, man. I keep trying to do the shit. I can't figure that shit. And then, want to do sound, you gotta download a widget. It'd be really great. It really helps with doing this and doing that. Fuck. If it works so great, why you gotta use widgets then? Ow! This is damn good bacon, though. I can't even think it's such a good meal. Such a good bagel. Half a peer-to-peer is not. What? From who? Motherfucker. That's bullshit. Who doesn't support peer-to-peer? What the hell is that about?